fly a lot, and every now and then in the airplane, you hit an air pocket, and all of a sudden that plane moves and everybody grabs their cocktail, right? So there was an air pocket, and that's what we've seen so far. We had so far this year. We started off really well in January. February is good riddance, right? And so I think we've hit an air pocket here. The good news, I suppose, to start with, is we got a PCE number, which is an inflation indicator, and it was 2.5%, Brian.
That's right. The inflation numbers were actually slightly better than a lot of people were fearing. You see goods prices actually pretty close to deflation instead of inflation. It's the service prices that are continuing to run a little bit hot. But thankfully, those have come down from about a 4.5% run rate to something closer to 3.5%. So it does seem like we are actually still making progress towards the Fed's 2% target. Within that PCE, the personal consumption expenditure data release that came out, we saw personal incomes rise. A lot of that Social Security cost of living adjustment. You also had dividend payments from businesses, so that showed up as far as investment income. But the spending numbers were actually negative 0.5% on the month, which was pretty big. A lot of the headlines were saying about how this was a huge drop in consumer spending, something we haven't seen since like 2021. But it was mostly due to the weather. You know, do you want to be out there in a car lot looking at new cars when it was sub-zero temperatures? No. And that's where we saw most of the weakness with spending was really in weather-related items that people typically would buy.
Weather-related, so it was only the cold fronts that we saw, but the fires in Los Angeles as well. And that does put a dent in confidence, but, you know, we want to make sure that confidence stays up. And, you know, there's no question we have a bifurcated economy.
Yeah.
You know, there's those who have and those who don't have, but that number has really shifted to the right, if you will, and we're 10% of the consumers make up a large portion of the consumer spending.
That's right. An analysis by Moody's Analytics showed that the top 10% of income earners are responsible for about 50% of consumer spending right now. That's up from what is typically the average, which is closer to about 30 to 35%. So over the last year, we have seen it, the haves versus the have-nots. That's, I think, also showing up in some of the confidence numbers, because when you look at consumer confidence, that was another data release that came out, which took a big move lower. People are fearful about, well, what's going to happen with inflation, growth, job security, things like that. That's not weighted by what people spend, so it's just kind of an average across consumers. And I think that you do have, as you put it, this bifurcated consumer right now.
And, you know, we'll be truth tellers here, because you're going to read a lot about what is really out there, and you're going to read that the Atlanta Fed's GDP forecast, which we do watch, was negative, right? And a negative 1.5%, and everybody knows from listening to the show, if you have back-to-back quarters of negative GDP, that's a recession. However, because we're going to be real on this show, it was negative, but a lot of that is trade related.
It was. There was a lot of evidence to suggest that people have been importing a lot more in anticipation of possible tariffs. We don't know if they indeed will go into effect or not. We'll learn more this upcoming week. But the reason why that Atlanta Fed number, it went from plus 2.5% down to minus 1.5%, because there was a huge increase in the imports. And just mathematically, imports are counted as a negative, so it's subtracted from GDP.
So let's just give
I'm
an
not
example.
too worried about it.
Yeah, so let's give an example. So you are a retailer in, you know, Central America somewhere, and so you ran to China or Europe or wherever you get your stuff, and you said, I want that now before this potential tariff comes into play. And so they went and bought all this stuff. It came in, and therefore that's a negative to GDP. So that could mean that it gets adjusted either next month or next quarter. So so when you see that, don't freak out that it's a negative GDP number, because there's certainly the press will spin that. The other thing I want to talk about is, you know, we talk about tariffs in GDP. 90% of our GDP number is from the United States, and that's consumer spending, government spending, and investment. 10% is foreign. And so all of these tariffs that we're talking about, even if you extrapolated that 10% out, put a tariff on that 10%, and now you're talking real numbers.
That's right. Yeah, it adds up to real dollar amounts. And I think one of the interesting things is when we look at how important trade is to the United States, it has been increasing over time. A lot of that has come from closer relationships with Mexico and Canada over the years. The average tariff that the United States applies to goods coming into the United States is around 2.5%. Now, with what has been proposed, it could jump that up depending upon what actually gets implemented. Some of the analysis suggests maybe that number goes to 10, maybe 25. But when you consider that trade is, let's say, exports plus imports is about 25% of GDP. Imports alone are only 10%. It will move the needle, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be enough to push the economy even temporarily into a recession if we get some sort of shock on the trade front.
And I certainly don't want to speak for President Trump, but we can take a look at it and try to analyze it. And I certainly don't want to be Zelensky talking to Trump, that's for sure. But if you look at it, if you look at what comes into this country, 10 to 25% on agricultural products is what they put tariffs on our stuff, right? 5 to 20% on consumer goods. And so the Europeans and others that said, well, we'll match it tit for tat if that really happens. Well, guess what? We're not charging anywhere near that. So if his takeaway is to level the playing field, yeah, then tariffs are going to go up. And people are saying, well, it's going to be inflationary if that happens. Maybe it's the negotiation that says, stop doing that to us and we'll get a fairer playing field.
I do think that people are presuming that it's the U.S. that is going to change its tariffs and it's not others who are going to change theirs. I mean, that's the whole premise behind the reciprocal tariff doctrine that Trump is following. It's reciprocal, meaning that what they do to us, we do to them. An example that I think is really easy to relate to is that, let's say, automobiles. If the United States ships a car over to Germany, Germans will tax the tariff of 10%. If they send it to the United States, we tax it 2.5%. Well, they could meet in the middle, they could lower it to 2.5, or maybe we do bump it up to 10%. There's a lot of room for negotiation here.
And then what I do want to leave it with is the S&P 500, while it did hit an air pocket here, right? And we're glad to see February go away.
Yeah.
Sales and earnings are up on the S&P 500 and some others. Spring is coming, and we'll see if these tariffs are only a negotiation. So take a chill pill.